Hi, I'm Jovan Grahovac. I'm assistant professor here at the Krannert School of Management in the strategic management area. Today I'd like to talk about one of my projects and one of my long-term research interests, which is the emergence of industrial clusters and performance of firms in these industrial clusters. If you think about finance, for example, it's all clustered around the New York area, entertainment in Los Angeles, automotive around Detroit, and so forth. And one of the interesting questions for managers and policymakers is why those clusters arise and what are the implications for the performance of those clusters and firms inside and outside those clusters. It's a very rich and complex phenomenon driven by a whole bunch of different things, apparently. So it's difficult to draw inferences based on just observations of the empirical world. And on the other hand, you cannot do analytical, elegant models that capture this richness of the phenomenon. So I chose to study this using simulation and try to discern what the underlying drivers are and what the internal dynamics of these clusters is. So essentially what I do with my co-author from the University of Texas at Austin, John Butler, is we design this chessboard in a sense, and we endow each of the fields in the chessboard with a couple of entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, scientists, and engineers, and then we let them look for each other, start firms, and start to produce their good. And we run large numbers of randomly generated scenarios, and then we can observe what happened and track firms, their performance, clusters, and so forth. So this is a nice complement to the empirical and purely analytical research, in the sense that it can give us some guidance as far as what to look for in the empirical studies of the phenomenon. Why should we care about this? Well, for managers, it's really important to know what to anticipate and to be able to predict consequences of their actions, and analysts as well. So managers, analysts, policymakers, they all have much interest, strong interest in knowing more about this phenomenon. So far, we find we have some preliminary results in which we find that. Of course, low transportation costs favor the emergence of clusters, but it's also interesting how when the numbers are really small, when the number of entrepreneurs and scientists in each field is relatively small, just a little random variation in the initial success of these firms can really lead to the formation of a cluster. We also find some interesting dynamics with respect to the profitability of these firms inside the cluster and outside the cluster. And we find that in talent-driven and labor-driven clusters and industries, the firms in the cluster actually tend to hurt each other as far as profits. So it's kind of maybe an interesting example of Microsoft, which is outside Silicon Valley and ends up doing really well, whereas lots of firms in the Silicon Valley went belly up and under.